Hi, this is Huang Zhenyu, along with my co-host Ken Walcox, and welcome to another episode of China 411. Today, the topic will be about family history. China and the US have had a very intermingled history for the past 100, 200 years, and we have as our guest Anne Shu, who's going to speak very interestingly about her family. Welcome.
Thank you, Z. Hi, Ken. Good to
Hello,
see you.
Anne. Anne, why don't you start by giving us just kind of a quick thumbnail sketch of your own personal journey, just the high points.
My own personal, not my family yet. I was born in Tsinghua, Tsinghua University in Beijing. And
Your family lived right on campus?
yes, my father was a professor in Tsinghua. So I was born and raised in Tsinghua, went to the elementary school. I don't know if you know, but Tsinghua is like a little town or city by itself. It has walls, it has everything is self-contained.
Like Stanford.
Stanford doesn't
Stanford
have
doesn't have any
walls.
walls.
Right?
Yeah. Same idea, though.
Yes, but did the Stanford's faculty and staff and students all live there? Because in Tsinghua, everybody lived inside. 10,000 students, but like 50,000 other people. So it's like a little town with its post office, train station, bank, that everybody lived inside. So elementary school, middle school, high school. So I was in the elementary school until age 11 when my family immigrated to Erie, Pennsylvania, of all places. So then I spent the next 10 years in Pennsylvania, middle school, high school, and college. Studied what every Chinese parents wants their kids to study, electrical engineering. And then came out to Berkeley for more electrical engineering. And I was on my way to PhD, like my father, until I stopped to ask myself about a year into it, saying, why do I want a PhD? And what would I do with a PhD? I thought about it and thought that I really don't want to teach. I'm not really a heads-down research person. And what I really wanted to do was to go back to China and visit, because I hadn't been back for 13 years since our family left. So after I graduated from Berkeley, that was in 91, I went back to Tsinghua and taught for a year. So that was my first time after immigrating from China. I went back to Tsinghua to teach for a year. I taught computer languages, I taught English to the freshman and sophomore students in Tsinghua. Tsinhua's English department, foreign language department. So I taught 2 classes of students there. And then it was a really, really interesting year in China. It was like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Sliding Doors, where Gwyneth Paltrow runs to catch the subway in New York. One scenario, she catches the subway. And the other scenario, the door closes on her and she misses.
Oh, so
And
you
it
see 2
keeps
scenarios.
her, it tracks her life. The one with the subway, catching the subway, and the one without. So for me, going back to Tsinghua was like, if my parents had not taken me away to the US, my student's life would have been my life. Because I most likely would have gone on to Tsinghua Middle School, likely to have gone to Tsinghua for university, and then their dorms, their cafeteria, their life, morning exercise to night study, self-study session would have been my life. So it was really interesting for me to go back to Tsinghua and see, this would have been my life.
Can we hold just 1 second? Just move that microphone up.
So it doesn't
It's in here.
Oh.
a little high? Yeah.
Oh.
To take out the tape right range.
Oh,
Okay.
take out the tape?
Yeah.
Where's the tape?
Or just attach it to her nose.
Tape it?
Yeah.
Like here?
know this one joke I really enjoyed.
What's that?
You're like, what's the
Oh, yeah?
It's
like?
still rolling.
Oh yeah, you're just like Aman. You're not Indian either.
Armand's
like a
not
what?
Indian. Armand is
Yeah.
not Indian.
No, he goes up to this girl. He's like, "Oh, you know Aman?" She's like, "Yeah," and Ken's like, "Yeah, you're just like Aman. You're not Indian."
I did that.
Yeah, that was like the
I don't
funniest.
remember that. It was a good joke though.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
So, and
Do we go back?
yeah,
You guys can throw your next question.
yeah. What were the other two trips back then?
Yeah, so that was the first time, was a year from 91 to 92 teaching in Tsinghua. And then I took the opportunity and traveled around China, clockwise around China for 9 weeks. And backpacked in 1992 when there were still the foreign currency and the Chinese currency and the foreign prices and the Chinese prices, and tried to swindle my way to getting some sleeper tickets on the trains. So it was really a fun time, interesting time. And then I came back and I said, well, I have to find a job. So I found a job here in Silicon Valley with my double E degree. What else are you going to do? So I started working with Tandem Computers. But but I decided that I wanted to go back to China again to work this time, because the first trip was in the university, kind of nostalgic route finding experience. I wanted to experience more of the real life, the working life. So, but there were really, I didn't see any direct route to that, because even though in the 90s, many companies were going to China, I thought, well, who would send me back? I could speak some Chinese, but there are lots of people who can speak Chinese better than me, and they worked in Silicon Valley for a long time. I just barely started, so, well, never mind. I'll just put my head down, do my software development. So I actually, lived like 3 miles away from Tandem, and I biked to work and did my thing. And lo and behold, 2 years later, I was back in China for Tandem's joint venture in Shanghai. They started a joint venture software development firm in Shanghai. It was the second one after HP's joint venture. This was in 1994.
How'd it turn out?
It turned out well. It's still one of the biggest software development companies in Shanghai right now. It's called Huateng. Yeah. So I went when it was just starting, and maybe less than a year into it, I was sent along with maybe a handful of Tandem veterans. They were the 6 or 7 men at that time were maybe in their mid 40s. A couple decades, at least a decade with Tandem. My boss was Tandem employee number 100. And I was the only 26-year-old female that went over, but it was purely luck. I call it in Chinese, 天上掉馅饼. A pizza fell from the sky into my lap. This opportunity.
A pizza.
A pizza, Chinese pizza. It was
No pepperoni.
No.
inside. Yeah. So it was just a very fortunate opportunity that the only thing I knew how to do in Tandem, that was the project that they chose to send over to Shanghai. So I volunteered to go and teach a team of 8 engineers in Shanghai, fresh out of school, smart kids. I taught them how to code with Tandem stuff. So spent 2 years mostly in Shanghai, about 70%, and then 30% traveling around. So that was my second stint back to China. And then what brought me back here was because Tandem wanted, after I did the software development and do some project or account management, they pushed me more and more towards marketing and sales of software development services. And I, being an engineer, knew nothing about marketing and sales. So I thought, well, maybe I should get an MBA. So I came back to Berkeley.
Oh,
and
that's
got my
the
MBA.
Berkeley
Yes. Well, it's
connection.
my second time Berkeley, right? The
Yeah,
first time was the electrical engineering, but I came back for my MBA. And did my MBA here, finished up in 98. And I thought that I wanted to go back to China again, but there were no, I actually decided that for the rest of my life, I was going to be back and forth. So I wasn't in a hurry to go back. 98 was the start of the .com boom here. So after a short stint at Siebel Systems, Philips Electronics, I actually started a .com with a partner in 2000
Here.
here. And we were Silicon Valley Bank's client at that time. So I think for the whole 12 years that the company was around. So the .com, we started officially in 2000. And in 2006, I went back to Shanghai to start a subsidiary of the company in Shanghai. So that's the third time. In 2006, and I just moved back less than a year ago, so it's about 9.5 years.
So don't you also have a yogurt factory or a dairy in Xinjiang,
I
the most
do,
western of the provinces?
yes.
How'd that happen?
Yes, well, that happened because I was in Shanghai in 2006 for the company was called Rival Watch, the .com company. And that went for about 6 years. And the headquarters, which always stayed here with CEO and investors, everybody here, they decided to sell the company. And I was fined 12 years, enough. They didn't want to, the acquiring company didn't want to keep the operation in China because they had a bigger operation in India. So they just wanted us to move what we were doing to India. So I said, fine, I helped them move. And then I thought, I've been at this high-tech thing for 20 years. Now that I'm, free of this, what do I do? I wanted to stay in China because my kids were just starting elementary school. I have twin boys. They were just starting first grade in 2012, and I wanted them to have at least as much Chinese foundation as I did, because I left at age 11. I thought they should go through some elementary school, learn Chinese, and then we moved back for middle school. So I said, well, if I'm going to be in China, what do? I really couldn't picture myself working at Microsoft or Google or HP or these kind of tech companies that have been my life for 20 years. I said, I want to do something completely different. And in 2008, actually, my friend that I met in 1991 in Tsinghua, he's an Uyghur friend. Uyghur is the ethnic minority that is the majority in Xinjiang, which is the far westernmost province of China, north of Tibet. And Adil is his name. He was a Tsinghua graduate, so when I went to Tsinghua to teach, he had already graduated, but we just became friends because he was still hanging out with foreigners there. He looks like a foreigner himself. He looks more like you than you or me. So we stayed friends for all these years, and he returned back to China he lived in Turkey for a decade or so, and a couple years here in San Francisco too. Returned back to China, and he had wanted to do dairy products because in Turkey, the Uyghurs culture and the Turk culture actually share the same roots, and they have the same dietary habits. And they eat lots of dairy products, yogurt and cheese and stuff. And he returned to Xinjiang and found that the things that he had gotten used to eating in Turkey, and when he was little in Xinjiang, he comes back to Xinjiang and there was nowhere to be found in the supermarkets. They were only found at home by grandmas who still made them, in the restaurants, the ethnic restaurants, Xinjiang restaurants, Uyghur restaurants. And then on the streets, when you make some and then you just bring it out onto the street to sell. And he thought, well, why isn't there anything in the Carrefour or some supermarket that sells this kind of stuff? And so he thought that was an opportunity. And he asked me in 2008 if I could help him raise some money. And I was still running Rival Watch at the time. And I talked to some VC friends in China and found that the VCs in China were very different from the VCs that I was dealing with in Silicon Valley.
So let's go back just a minute to your dad. Your dad taught at Tsinghua for a number of years, but didn't he, as a very young man, come to the U.S. at one point?
Or can we even take us back further
Yeah.
to your grandfather? Is that okay? We
Yeah,
start
that's
from the
fine.
beginning.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, it's interesting. for me, when I went back 3 times, I go back to China, and I always ask myself, why do I have this desire to go back? I'm fine. I got whatever degrees I need here. I can live and work and be well in Silicon Valley is, best as anybody here. Why do I care to go back to China? Maybe not live in, less material, whatever, well-off means. And I think on this 10-year trip, and I found out why. And part of the reason has to do with my dad, and part of the reason has to do with my great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather. So my father's grandfather.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who do we want to start? My father or my
Start from
great-grandfather?
the beginning.
Start with your great-grandfather.
Start with my great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather is a minorly well-known figure in contemporary Chinese history. His name is Xu Qian, George Xu. He was actually part of the last dynasty's court. He was I think, the Attorney General of Beijing City, as the last official post that he had in the early 1900s. And then when Dr. Sun Yat-sen started the New China Revolution, he actually was one of 2 people inside the last dynasty to come out and join the revolution. So he worked closely with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and he actually wrote, I found out later that my great-grandfather actually was responsible for a lot of the legal code that he wrote while he was still in the last dynasty, and then was the foundation for the new China's legal system, because he was actually sent around to a lot of European cities, as well as Washington, D.C. and New York, to study the legal system of the Western countries, and then come back to China's emperor, make recommendations to put
That would have been almost
framework.
exactly 100 years ago.
Oh, more.
More?
This is the late 1800s.
Oh, late 1800s
Yes,
already.
late 1800s in 1900 something. Yeah, so he did this, and then, but he believed, not in so much authoritarian rule, and wanted to create a legal system that would be the basis of any civil society. So he did that, and then he joined Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And then, as you know, contemporary Chinese history, there's a lot of turmoil, lots of different governments. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek were actually a generation later than Dr. Sun Yat-sen, than my great-grandfather. Right? So he was like their elder. There were no communists or nationalists in the beginning. There were just the nationalists. Right? So he was, so in one of those governments, there were many, Z probably knows, there were many temporary governments in Wuhan, in Chongqing, Nanjing, and Beijing in southern China. He was actually the chairman or president of China for maybe a week in Wuhan before that government was overthrown by whichever warlord. I can't keep track of them. But anyway, so, and he was in exile in Hong Kong when Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and the communists started fighting, and they accused him of being a communist, and then the communists, but he was somewhat sympathetic to the communists. But when the Japanese invasion happened, and the 2 sides, the communists and nationalists, were being asked to work together to fight the Japanese, he was actually asked to, because Dr. Sun Yat-sen had passed away by then, very young. So my great-grandfather was called in from Hong Kong to help mediate the 2 parties, because he's there, a generation older, right? To help them get together to fight the Japanese instead of fighting each other. But unfortunately, he died from some, I don't know, hepatitis or some disease that he contracted. So he didn't, he wasn't able to serve China in that capacity. But I say that because he is one of those characters that wanted to do something for China, to do something, for his belief. He was quite idealistic, and he was not a corrupt politician like many are. But that doesn't say that his family did not take advantage of him being in powerful positions. So his family got a lot of perks offered to him. So my grandfather, so his son, was offered a lot of things. And I think I heard that he was brought to the brothels in Shanghai and contracted VD or something. And you can beep that up. But so his mother decided, my great-grandmother decided that he must take her son out. Because in Shanghai, the society, he's just going to, not good things are going to happen to him. So my grandfather actually went to undergraduate in Columbia or Harvard or one of these places.
This is your grandfather?
My grandfather, yes.
Oh my gosh.
So this is the George Shu's son.
Your father's father.
Yes, yes. So my grandfather, Edward Shu, went to undergraduate in Columbia, and then I think he transferred to Harvard or something, or Yale. But as a result, his English was very good. At that time, all the other Chinese students in the U.S. came for graduate school. My grandfather was one of very few who came for undergraduate. So his English was very good. So he returned to China afterwards, and my father and others were born. So it so happened that when my father was in 9th grade, my grandfather came with the China's rep to the World Bank. This must be in the mid-40s, 45 or something. China sent somebody to the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and that person didn't speak much English, so my grandfather was this person's assistant, personal secretary. So because his English is very good, and so that's how my grandfather brought his whole family. My father, his brother, and all came to the United States. And my father was in 9th and 10th grade. Those 2 years, my father went to school in New York and in Washington, D.C.
But then your father went back to China.
Yeah, so he did 2 years there, and then along with his family, they returned to China. And then it was 1948. The communists were coming into China, to Shanghai, and lots of people were fleeing, including my grandparents. Right, so my grandfather and grandmother, who had just come back to China not long before that, left again.
To where?
To go to Hong Kong and then flee to Taiwan or wherever you could.
And they had your father with them?
No, my father, because he was finishing up high school. He was already 16, 17. So they decided that he would finish high school in Shanghai and then go to Hong Kong to join them, to go to the U.S. or somewhere. So in 1948, 49, my father finished high school in Shanghai, went to Hong Kong to join his parents, but then they had already left. They left $2,000 for him in Hong Kong with a relative and says, you buy a boat ticket, and we've arranged for you to come to Emory University for college. So you just buy yourself a ticket and take a boat and come to the United States to join us. So my father, while in Hong Kong, decided that because he had lived in the U.S. for 2 years, he knew what the society was really like, the good and the bad, and he saw that the Chinese in America then were really of two societal tiers. One was the kind of the diplomatic layer where he was, right? And then the other was the restaurants and laundromat people, very low class. And my dad, if he would come to the U.S. at that time in 49 again, he wouldn't be part of this elite again. And he thought, well, rather than be a second or third class citizen in the U.S., why don't I return to China, join the revolution, build a new China, help build a new China, and be a first class citizen in my own country. So this is a very idealistic young man, 17-year-old. So he decided to take the $2,000. That'll be enough for him to, go to school or whatever, live on for a while. Went back to Beijing, took the college entrance exam, got into a university called Yanqing. Have you heard of Yanqing? Yeah. So Yanqing only existed for like a couple years. In 1951, it was divided into Beijing University and Tsinghua University. So I guess the liberal arts went to the Beida, and then the technical side went to Tsinghua. So my father studied technical, so he went to Yanqing and then finished up in Tsinghua University. So he had this, passion and idealism to go back and build a new China and really contribute.
Well, isn't it also true that at that point in time, Chairman Mao was telling everybody that he was going to build a democratic China?
Yeah.
And I think I think your father, because I spoke with him about this once, I think he said that he was quite attracted to that whole concept.
Yeah, and I think my father was not the only intellectual or idealistic young person at that time. Many people returned
Right.
to join the revolution
Yeah.
and build a new China. I think in the intellectual, so I'm helping my father write his memoirs, and Ken, you read some of that. It really helped me understand the state of the intellectuals in China at that time, because really they felt that China should not be colonized by Western influences, and should really be its own culture, and really wanted to build a new China. So they were really, they loved that Mao was able to, the communists were able to, and dare to stand up to the Western powers and kick him out of China. It really, I think the intellectuals in China, the young people in China really liked that. And of course, Mao would say that he wants a democratic. Maybe he did at one time. Maybe he just didn't know how to execute that, or maybe power went to his head later or something. But the idealism, I think, was not just felt by my father. It was a bunch of young people at that time. And unfortunately, later, many of those people suffered and maybe lost their lives. And fortunately for my father, he survived the 30 years. So he was there, 48, 49, he returned. And then our family immigrated in 1978, end of 78.
So there was like almost 30 years that your dad was back in China. What was that like for him?
It's really, really interesting for me to have read his memoir, to help him edit through that. It told me a lot about how life was like in those 30 years. So I guess if I were to summarize in his words, there were swings from left to right of the various policies. Mao was sometimes in more firm control than others. Right? When Mao was not in such firm control, when Mao was in firm control, the policies were more left-leaning, and then when he was not, the likes of Deng Xiaoping and others before him were a little more pragmatic, and then they were, Mao would label them as rightist in the whichever movements. And my father, being in Tsinghua University, belonged to the intellectual elite, which was picked on a lot by the the communists. So I think during the times when the policies were more pragmatic and wanted to build new China, my father felt that he was able to contribute his technical expertise and actually did something. So he actually designed the first ever mini car, completely domestic China designed and made car in Beijing, in Tsinghua. And that actually became a pet project for Zhou Enlai, the premier. So it was, Zhou Enlai really liked that project, and had my father drive the car and to show him in Zhongnanhai, and then had the Beijing taxi company or factory manufacture some of these cars to drive as taxis around Beijing in the 50s. And But during the time, so those were the times when, I think another thing that I remember was those times they would use the intellectuals' expertise for China purposes, right? So my father, for a time, was also asked to evaluate and recommend a lot of, so my father, automotive engineer in Tsinghua, evaluate and recommend a lot of really nice cars like Mercedes, Jaguars, BMWs, all this stuff. And my father really, wasn't sure what these cars were for. He just recommended to these people. They were kind of like the CIA of China. Said these are the powerful cars, and so then these cars would be imported, and they would ask my dad to check it out, and my dad would get to drive these cars. And later on, as he talked to the drivers, he found that actually these cars were used to tail the Western embassy people around Beijing, because the Western diplomats all had these cars, whichever country they're from, and these nice cars, imported cars. And if the Chinese were to tail them in the Soviet cars or whatever Chinese cars, it would be too obvious. So they would import these equally nice Western cars and drive around Beijing and tail these Western diplomats. So my dad got to drive some of these. So in the periods where policies were a little more pragmatic and they used intellectuals for these purposes, right? But then when you get to periods where Mao was in more control and the policies were more left-leaning, then the intellectuals were just the pits of society. They call it the 臭老九, because there were 8 classes of enemies of people. The landlords, whatever. I don't remember these 8 classes. The intellectuals were not officially part of the 8, but they, because they were treated so badly, they called themselves the stinky number 9 class.
The what?
The stinky number 9.
Stinking?
Yeah.
Number 9.
臭.
Oh, that's where the 臭 fits in.
臭老九. Yeah, the
okay.
stinky number 9. They were not officially enemy of the people, but they were treated so badly that they might as well have been the number 9.
Yeah.
The stinky number 9 class. So they were sent to the farms during the Cultural Revolution. My father was sent to the farms in Jiangxi to grow rice, and so a lot of people. So there were no school at that time. All of Tsinghua was sent to different places. Different departments went to different places, and the mechanical engineering department was sent to Jiangxi for a couple of years. So
To plant rice.
To plant rice, yes.
So how did that work out that he brought the family back in 1978?
Yeah. So my father is a pretty idealistic person, and I think that must partly be from his grandfather's genes. He wanted to contribute to China, and he felt that at certain periods he was able to, but other periods he just couldn't do anything. He was, for all of the 30 years, he was under the suspicion of being a spy.
For the Americans.
For, somebody. Because a lot of the communists couldn't understand why his mom and everybody in his family was in the U.S. or outside of China. He's the only guy there. So they were always thinking, why are you here? You must be a sleeper spy or something. So he was never trusted with anything. Even during the technical projects where he designed, at one time I think he helped design a mini SUV during the Vietnam conflict era. They were testing the SUVs in Yunnan province, close to the border of Vietnam, and he was not allowed to get too close to the border because they thought he might defect or something. So he was never trusted. I guess he didn't have security clearance in modern day jargon. So he was always being suspected of being a spy, never really trusted with any information. So after 30 years, he was getting pretty disillusioned with China, but really the what he really couldn't stand was the fact that his kids, his children, my brother is 10 years older than me. So I was born in 67. My brother was 10 years old when the Cultural Revolution started. So that means my brother didn't get a very good education. And when he graduated high school, he could not go to college because only the kids from good family backgrounds could go. And good family backgrounds are peasants or workers. And our family background is intellectuals, and it's completely not good. So my brother could not go to college. And for my father, who is an intellectual, to not be able to have his kids go to school, not because he's not good at studying, just because of something that's completely not under the kids' control, it just was, no, it was not good. My father couldn't.
So throughout those generations, what do you think is the common thread? What brings each generation back to China?
I think I realized this halfway through this past year, 10-year stint. I realized perhaps one of the reasons that I keep coming back to China is because of my father, because of my great-grandfather, that we want to do something that is a little more meaningful, something that is more than just making a nice living and having a comfortable life. So I think, my life here in Silicon Valley is pretty good and comfortable, and but it got a little, I don't want to say meaningless, but it got a little boring and a little not quite meaningful to think that the whatever work I put in and the energy and time that I put in is helping some company make more money. They don't need me to do that. They really don't. When I'm doing it myself for my own company, that's challenging and interesting for a while, but after a while, it's still not really that meaningful to me. So I think maybe the common thread for me and my father and my great-grandfather is that we're trying to see some more meaning to our lives. For the energy, the time that we put in to do anything, have it have more impact than just a nice life for ourselves, right? And I think that's maybe part of the reason why I keep going back to see if I can do more things there that would impact more people than here in Silicon Valley. Nobody needs me here. This place, chums along without me just fine, so I don't need to be here.
What about your kids?
My kids?
What would you like them to be able to do in terms of U.S., China, and their futures?
Their life, not my life. I think my father takes that attitude too. My father never asked me to go or asked me not to go. He just never meddled in my life. And I don't think I would meddle in my kids' life either. I think they went through 4.5 years of Chinese, completely Chinese school, not international school in Shanghai. They learned Chinese, they got a good foundation. After being here for a year, they're already not speaking much Chinese at all, but that's expected. And I think that if in the future they want to do something, like I wanted to do something, then it would be easy for them to pick up Chinese at that time. It'll be easier for them than for Ken, spending all this time learning Chinese. So if they want to do that, they have the tools and the foundation to do that. If they don't want to do it, it's fine. I think they are free to pursue their life as my.
So one other quick question here from me anyway, and that is 1978. Your father is able to take his whole family out of China and move to wherever, the U.S. somewhere.
Yes.
How was that possible? Because nobody else was moving in 1978. People didn't
That's
start moving until
right.
1980, 81.
Official U.S.-China diplomatic relations were established on January 1st, 1979. So our family left China December 28th, 1978.
3 days,
3
4
days
days early.
before, yes. So we were not, There was
You were a
no.
special case.
We were a special case.
Why?
Because Nixon went to China in '72 and started the talks with China. My grandmother, so my father's mother and father were in the States since the 50s, right? They left. My father decided to go back, but my grandparents were in the States. They got divorced, and then my grandmother married someone who became a diplomat for Taiwan, nationalist government. So he was this gentleman, Frank Xie, and my grandmother were sent to Brazil to be the ambassador for China, because while mainland China was closed off to the rest of the world, the only China on the world stage was Taiwan's government, right? So they were diplomats in Brazil and Argentina and somewhere. So my grandmother had contacts in the, foreign service and diplomatic circles. So after Nixon went in '72, she said, "Oh, let me, try through my contacts to see if I can get my son out, because it's been many, many years since I've seen my son." So she started asking for us and applying for us. And then there were letter communications, but it was all censored, meaning it was all read by somebody. So you couldn't really write anything in it. Important stuff had to be verbally brought by Hong Kong people were able to visit inside China in the 50s and 60s. Right? So somehow they brought word that my grandmother was trying to apply for us to go, and my father, had asked to see if he can go see his mother and stuff in, I think, 1974. The request was denied. There was no way to go. So filed that, forget it. And then in 1976, Mao died. Deng came to power and really started talking to the U.S. and the rest of the world to try to open China up to the rest of the world. So by '77 and '78, rumor had it that Carter and Deng were directly communicating from the White House to Deng, and not through the official foreign service diplomatic channels, and negotiating resume of relationships. And one of the things that Carter and the U.S. Asked for was family reunions. So Deng supposedly said, "You want Chinese? You can have 100,000." But they looked in the records. They wanted to find some family reunion cases to show that, okay, we'll allow family reunions. So actually in '78, early '78, they came to us to say, you wanted to go to America? Do you still want to go? So my father and mother and my brother, at that time was already 21, had a 3-people family meeting. I was too young. I didn't know what was going on. They didn't ask me. The 3 of them voted on whether they wanted to go to the U.S. or not. My mother and my brother wanted to go. My father was somewhat ambivalent, because by that time the policies, Mao was gone. The policies under Deng were, more pragmatic again, and the intellectuals were, raised up again, says, okay, we now need you to build China. Right? So he was promoted to being a full professor from lecturer and all these other things. So he was thinking, okay, maybe I get another chance to do what I wanted to do 30 years ago. But then my mother and my brother said they wanted out. So my father, being a democratic point of view, said, okay, well, let's go. So they decided to leave. And I just kind of went along. I didn't know what was going on.
Wonderful. Well,
Amazing story, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think in many ways it speaks to what China has been like for the past 100 years. So thank you again, Anne. And this wraps up another episode of China 411. See you in the future.